Hi, my name is Olivia Morrison. I work for the national office here in Columbus as the conference student staff, and I'm also a mortarboard in the chapter at The Ohio State University. Welcome to Women's Leadership in the Workplace, and I have the distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker for this session, Dr. Kirsten Fox. Kirsten is our new executive director for mortarboard. Although she may only have 1 month on the job experience, she has spent the past 2 decades working in higher education, focused on areas such as career development and leadership development. Kirsten is a graduate of The Ohio State University and a former chapter advisor at the University of Maryland. Please welcome Dr. Kirsten Fox.
Thank you, Olivia. We are so lucky to have her as our student intern. I am going to share my screen and hope that this is going to now work. Oops, now I've just lost. I can't believe I'm now the one that lost my Zoom controls. All right, share. I have 3 screens in front of me. Okay, everyone, if you cannot see the screen, let me know, but I think you can see it. Yes, excellent. All right, well, as Olivia mentioned, Kirsten Fox, the new executive director of mortarboard. And it's really great to be here. It's actually 1 month and 1 day. But as Liv mentioned, I have spent the last 20 years working in higher education. And I have always had a, really since probably when I first, before, but really when I first joined mortarboard and learned about the rich history and tradition. And even being in this role, to think back to over 100 years ago when college women came together to talk about advocacy and equity and advancing the status of women on both college campuses and beyond. It really piqued my interest in a lot of women's leadership. I had taken some leadership studies classes in college and in graduate school, and right away started to note some of the differences in gender. And over the past 30 years, I continued to try to incorporate it into my day-to-day work. And so it's really great to be now working in an organization that also is looking not only at the advancement of women, but really equity in so many different facets, from gender and race and ethnicity and socioeconomic status and so many other areas. So just to sort of set the stage a little bit, I wanted to provide some background on women in the workplace and what we know. Now, I want to preface this with most of the research that is out there is very gendered in a very binary sense, right? It's a lot of comparisons between men and women. And at mortarboard and personally, we recognize that gender is not binary. And so note that I will often talk about women and am really trying to talk about female identified people. Now, for those of you that are college students and still have a long life of research ahead of you, there's a lot of work to be done in gender equity, particularly looking at various genders besides just men and women. So I'm just going to make that little plug. So kind of note that as a site of this research and a limitation of a lot of the research that I'm going to bring into today's conversation. So what we do know is that the majority of college students today identify as female, right? Over 50%. Women comprise about 50% of the workforce. However, corporate leaders are majority male identified. Okay. So that's something that obviously we've probably heard quite a bit. One of the things that I think is really interesting about that is it is not just big business. Even in the nonprofit sector, even in education, and sectors that traditionally are female dominated in terms of numbers of employees, the leadership roles are still held by men, right? So for example, 30% of college presidents are women compared to 70% are men. Likewise, college boards are predominantly men, not female, even though we know that the student bodies at both undergraduate and graduate level are predominantly women. We also know that women are less likely to apply for positions for which they are qualified. So from the very beginning of a career trajectory, women are often off balance to their male counterparts in terms of positions. So I don't know if this is more anecdotal. I haven't actually found a good statistic about it, but something that I've heard over and over again is on average, if a female is applying for a job and is in the job process and sees 10 qualifications, they have to have all 10 before they are willing to apply for a position, right? However, men will see the same job, see the same 10 qualifications, and if they have 6, they apply for that position, right? So right there, men are going to more likely apply for jobs that they are less qualified for than their female counterparts. Then once we get into the job, right, this is not a statistic that is new to anyone. Women earn 82 cents to every dollar that men earn. If you look at working dual parent households with both mothers and fathers in the same house, mothers earn 70 cents to every dollar that fathers earn, right? So then you add parenthood in, and that gap gets even bigger. We also know that hiring bias exists, and not only in gender, though this session is really focused on gender, but hiring bias exists. And people tend to hire others because it's a good fit, right? And what does a good fit mean? Oftentimes it means people are more likely to hire people like them. So we see that in terms of race, we see that in terms of gender. So if we've already talked about the majority of leaders are men or male, then they are more likely to hire other men because they feel they are a better fit, right? There's also bias in caretaker stereotypes. Oh, I don't know if we want to hire this female or this mother. She may need to take time off. She might need to be there for her children more, right? And so that is also a bias that exists in hiring bias. We also know that workplace sexual harassment happens, and this happens to both men and women, but it happens more frequently to women, and about 37% of women have stated that they have been sexually harassed in the workplace. Well, that then limits potential growth, it limits potential earnings. They may not volunteer to be part of things at work as much because they want to avoid situations. They may be bullied in the process. They may want to just leave work as soon as possible because it's so uncomfortable for them to be there. And so for lots of various reasons that go along with that, it makes it that much harder to advance within the workplace. And then again, women are more likely to stop out of work. There's a motherhood penalty, right? Women are more likely to be the primary caretaker for their children. And so therefore they may stop out, and then coming back into work makes it that much harder. Likewise, as generations are living longer, we're starting to see more women that are the primary caretaker for their aging parents. And so likewise, how is that going to continue to impact sort of maybe a second stopping out as they're becoming caretakers again, but for parents? So that kind of sets the stage a little bit. A few things to just take a closer look at. I mentioned this before, but I wanted to break it down. This is some great data from American Association of Undergraduate Women. So college women receive more associate degrees and more bachelor's degrees. Right? And most of our collegiate members that are here today are obviously working on their baccalaureate degree. So 57% of bachelor's degree recipients in today's times are female. They also earn more master's degrees than men. And while it's a little bit under, it's relatively even at 48% of both medical and law degrees are held by women graduating today. We also want to take into account the intersection of race and gender, right? So Black and Latinx students are similarly overrepresented in lower earning majors, right? So if you think about not only are women earning more degrees, but then if you look at kind of the little sidebar, the side square, women are more likely to be in lower paying majors, right? So lower earning majors. While 9 of the 10 highest paying majors, predominantly in the STEM fields, are dominated by men. Then you also bring in race, and particularly women of color are that much less likely to have the same earnings, not only right away, but then over time. Also within higher education, kind of bringing it back to the college landscape, women are disproportionately burdened by student debt. So if we also know that it takes longer for degree completion, often for Black and Latinx students, Black and Latinx students tend to have more student debt, women tend to have more student debt. That means right out of the starting gate, from the time they earn their degree and get their first job, it's that much harder to kind of catch up and not only pay, but then also in terms of position. All right, moving on a little bit more. So these are just some graphs that are a little bit hard to tell, but McKinsey and Company did some research in 2020 about women in the workplace. And this just is another way to look at both gender and also then kind of gender and race. And you can see we actually haven't made much progress in the past 6 years. So we have talked so much. If you think about Lean In, and we've started hearing more about Sheryl Sandberg, and there have been more podcasts and women that have really elevated in recent years kind of the conversation around women leadership in the workplace. We haven't made all that much progress. Now, granted, this is only half of a decade, but I think it's still really important to note. At the same time, so that's the progress in the half decade. COVID, we are living still in COVID, but COVID is expected to set women back even more than half a decade. So we made that progress. It's not as much as maybe people think it should be. Hopefully most people think it should be, but we have now gone back potentially even more, right? In particular, as children have been out of schools, women again often assume primary caretaker role of both children and maybe also their own family parents and aging parents. You can see the different amount of time that mothers and fathers spend on chores. And that as a result is often setting women back even more, right? It was hard to maintain their same work hours when they were also full-time school teacher. So we're going to get to a discussion because I really want to hear what everybody else has to say. But I'm trying to think about, so what does this mean for, as Mortarboard as a society that has always been founded around the principles of advocacy for women and the advancement of women. And then more recently, and really, as we've all read in history, earlier than most organizations, right, the advancement of all peoples. How do we specifically continue to move the needle forward in terms of women's leadership, right? So we can make work more sustainable. We can reset norms around flexibility. I think one thing we have also all learned in COVID is look how easily we can utilize technology to potentially to zoom in, to do meetings, to do our work, and then maybe have a little bit different work balance than before. But we also need to take a different look at how we both hire and promote from within in ways to minimize gender discrepancies. Obviously, there are a lot of policies and programs that are out there to better support employees, particularly, family leave being one of them, healthcare being another, educational policies, again, being able to even have access to grants as opposed to loans. So we are not as burdened by student debt, for example, are all different policies that as a general society and public we can work on. Obviously employee communication just in general, and then again, eliminating some of that hiring bias. So individually, and at some point I was just talking with my colleagues during our pizza break on negotiation, but there's things that we can do individually, right? Whether we identify as a female or not, we are all responsible for helping to advance all peoples. And so think about how can we be confident in our own skills to showcase our talents, right? There's also a lot of leadership data that's out there that shows that men are more likely to exude confidence. Again, right, we see this in the hiring or in the application data. They only need to check 6 of the qualifications to think that they're qualified to apply. Where oftentimes women think they need to have all 10 to apply, right? So how do we become more confident? How do we build our own skills, competencies, talents? How do we articulate our value? How do we continue to make connections, right? Mortarboard National Conference is one of those ways. We can continue to make personal and professional connections. Oftentimes, men are more willing to put themselves out there, according to research, right? Where oftentimes females don't want to offend or bother someone else. But we need to make connections, right? There's the kind of the quotes such as "strangers are just friends we haven't met yet." So putting ourselves out there to make those connections, right? You're meeting lots of alums and other collegiates throughout this conference. How do you follow up with them afterwards so you can help each other out as you move through different career trajectories? Right? Because it is important to help others as well. You never know who's going to be in a position to help you in the future, and you can help someone in the future as well. As you're searching for your, for many of you that are entering your last year of college and maybe applying to grad school, maybe going directly into the job market, how do you go into your job search, right? How do you in particularly negotiate for yourself and know your value? And this is where I put a little art of negotiation box. So oftentimes, when you're in particularly the salary negotiation, it can be a really uncomfortable conversation. But if you could think about, again, the statistic that women earn 82 cents to the dollar that men earn. So if you start at that level and then your salary increases and retirement is based on a percentage of your earnings, that means men on average are earning 18% more, they have that 18% more earnings that's being contributed to their retirement, right? So similarly, if cost of living or wage increases are based off of a percentage of your salary, right? 5% of $1 is more than 5% of 82 cents. And then the gap just continues to grow, right? So that's why that very first job, that very first time you're negotiating can make such a difference. And it can be really hard. It is not a comfortable thing to talk about money. It is not a comfortable thing to advocate for yourself. And research has shown that it's even harder for women, right? And so oftentimes we don't. And that's why, not that is the reason the gap exists, it exists for lots of reasons, but it doesn't help, right? And so you see this text box, it's to feel comfortable talking about those accomplishments, right? If they've already offered you a position, they already want you on their team. They're already interested in you. They can come back and say no, but you can't get a yes if you never even ask, right? So you want to do your research though. You also can't just ask for a number that just sounds really good. So doing your research, you're all smart students, obviously, or smart alumni who are going to continue your searches, right? What is the target salary? Look at that midpoint range. I always say you add 10% because again, they could say no. So you're not adding 50%, but add a little bit more, and then they can always scale back. Right? And likewise, don't accept your first offer. Okay? Again, they can't tell you no if you never ask. And I'll admit, I can still remember I had an amazing boss. This was before some of you were probably even born. And I was so excited to get the position. I just accepted it on the spot. And I was really fortunate that she said to me, don't you want to think about it? And she didn't exactly say to me, you should come back and ask for more money. But you could tell she was giving me the space to do that, right? And I learned from that and realized, oh, right, that is an opportunity. But at the time I was like, well, I don't want to disappoint her. She's going to be my boss. I don't want to seem unreasonable. I just feel like I should be grateful for a job, something that tends to align more with particularly female college students. And then likewise, we have to be aware of our own biases as well, right? You might be the job seeker soon, but eventually you're going to be helping other people find jobs as well. And so again, how do we help others make connections? But how do we also check our own biases when we're in the process? Okay, so I've sort of gone through a whole bunch of stuff really quickly. I, at this point, really want to turn this into a discussion and talk about, so we know that there are these discrepancies. We know that we've been selected into Mortar Board for our scholarship, our leadership, our service. We care about equity and the advancement of peoples. So what can we do now back on our campus and in our chapter to help address some of the discrepancies in gender and leadership? So with that, I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen so I can see everyone front and center as opposed to going back and forth amongst many screens. Did I lose people? Are people still All right, I can see everyone again. I am going to ask folks to, I'd love to answer questions, but more so, I really want you to think through, and it looks for the majority of people that are here, great, it was a great turnout. So I'm going to turn it over to our fabulous students who are leaders in their own right to think about, so what does this mean, right? What does this mean for today? What does this mean for you? What does this mean for your chapters? Chat. Oh gosh, I missed all these chats come in. There's some really good things. Well, so while people are thinking, I hope people do speak out.
Go ahead, Hannah. I see you with your hand up.
Okay, I just had a quick question. Like, Converse is, we were a women's college and we still have the women's college on campus. However, it is now co-ed this year, and this will be our first like large group of freshmen coming in. How can we incorporate men without like distinguishing the leadership of women that we have currently?
Hannah, could you say that again? I'm sorry. Turning my volume up while you were talking.
Yeah, since Converse is going co-ed this year, I was just curious how we can incorporate men into our chapter without distinguishing the leadership of women that we have currently on campus.
That's a great question. And I also see some of our national leaders and our student rep. And I see Candy Pitts on the call and Katie Chick. So I'm going to ask them as well to chime in. You know, I think, you know, it's interesting. And I think I saw in, you know, one of the chats, it's how do you, right? You also don't want to lose the tradition of the history of women. And so I think trying to balance that is hard, because you also have this piece where how awesome was it that this organization was founded around really women's leadership, and at the same time for us to continue to move forward and to advance and have equity across genders, we need to also have male counterparts who recognize that and are also along in the journey to advocate for the advancement of women, right? And so it shouldn't just be women appreciating the efforts of women. It should be all people appreciating the efforts of women. And I think you can do that with, and it doesn't mean you can't continue to highlight the amazing things that women are doing, right? And I like I said, I'd like this to be more of a discussion, not just me as kind of the speaker, but I think this also goes into the conversation about underserved populations over time, right? And so men have not been traditionally underserved or oppressed populations, right? I think we can probably all agree on that. And so it doesn't mean that we can't continue to spotlight populations that need to be spotlighted, right? And I think that is something that we saw with Saul's conversation today, and Candy, it was you, I think, that put in the comment, right? I can't remember exactly what it is, and I hate to put you on the spot, right? But what was it? It was, we're not afraid of the stories that we hear, something, right? And so
so you know, we don't fear the people whose stories we know, and that comes from Margaret Wheatley, but she learned that when she worked with groups of women in Africa. And I think, Hannah, I was a mortar board when it was all female organization, but I think the important part is really sharing the stage with the students on your campus, male and female alike. And I think it's sitting down and having those heart-to-heart conversations. What is it that we want from mortarboard? You know, what are we looking for in our membership? And I think as long as you can have those really heartfelt and authentic conversations among your members and looking at the great men that want to become involved, I think you're going to be going forward. But it really takes that listening and speaking, but also really listening to other voices as well.
Yeah, Hannah, I'd love to weigh in too. This is Katie Chick, and I was a freshman the first year my alma mater went co-ed on campus. So one, we should probably chat way more in depth than like this whole group, but I will say we didn't get it right. It was hard. I was coming as a freshman to school, so I don't blame myself per se, but I think mortarboard is uniquely positioned to, like Candy said, actually really facilitate some of those hard discussions. We didn't do that very well at Hood. And so people got angry at the men that were coming in and angry when they got all new uniforms for their sports team and the women didn't. The practical reality was they didn't have any baseline, so they had to get new equipment, but there was a real big disparity to the point where when I was a senior, and doing admissions tours, people were like, why are there only women in the yearbooks before? Like Hood really went to another extreme to bring men to campus. And it was really, we wouldn't have been a college if we didn't go co-ed. We had to make that financial decision. But we didn't admit a man into our mortarboard chapter until my senior year elected the first like male members. And I felt it was a really important part of the legacy, hearing what the story was of mortarboard, but knowing we're not being representative of the campus if there's no men for 4 years in an organization like mortarboard. So, something to think through, especially if you have transfer students that come in along with this, like you'll have people that might be eligible for mortarboard year one or people that come in with a lot of credits. So it's hard, but I think I would love to see more chapters engaging the campus in that kind of dialogue, whether it's around going co-ed or if others aren't facing that, maybe just women's issues in general, or during an election cycle. Like these are hard conversations that are polarizing, but you all as leaders can maybe help be the ones that allow us to have more of a dialogue. But Hannah, let's chat separately because there's a lot of emotions that go along with that, and I'm here for that journey with you.
Thank you, Katie. Your perspective is really helpful. I mean, even for me to hear, right? That was not my experience by the time I was in college and just from a chapter and institutional level. So to hear that bit of history is great. And then I'm sure Hannah will connect with you afterwards as well. What a great resource she has on you. Patience, not to put you on the spot, but since you referenced it in the chat, some of the challenges that mortarboard has faced as an organization. Would you like to share more?
Well, I was just reflecting when Title IX passed and mortarboard went co-ed as such a powerful women's organization for so many years. How I was just thinking that we face that too as an organization, and I often reflect on how we tell our history around it now, and how that it was such an important part of our organization, and how I think sometimes we celebrate men's leadership in the organization in a weird way sometimes now, but other times I think it's just been a really important thing. I know on the campus that I went to, there was a men's senior honorary and a women's senior honorary, and then they both went co-ed, but mortarboard led the way, just to be clear. Not that there's any rivalry, but I just want to be clear, mortarboard's better. And it's just a really important part of our history. So I identified, Hannah, with your own thoughtful question and this organization's history as well.
Thank you, Patience. And there is a rivalry, having been at the same institution, but mortarboard is way better, obviously. So I want to point out, Crystal mentioned, and I think this is interesting also, right? If we educated the men on these statistics, maybe they could prevent this as well. And I do not want to make any assumptions. And so I am not sure how many male identified attendees are here today. But from looking at those of you that have put your pronouns in your name, I only see she, hers. And I was really hoping that it would be maybe more balance of attendees. And I think that's a really interesting point, Crystal, and something that I think through a lot is how, right, we have a conversation or a session on women's leadership, and more likely than not, women are going to show up for it. And so all of these things that we think about, whether we're at the collegiate level or again from, right, if we know that the people in these corporate or in these leadership positions are making the policies and they're men, and then we're talking about these statistics, but we're not around the table, I'm sure they've read them. I'm sure they know them, but again, maybe also why it's easier for them to hire someone like them. And I think you're right. I think it's how do we have these conversations more broadly? other thoughts or other questions about how you can sort of take this back to your campus chapter? Any thoughts on programs that you might want to do this upcoming year as a chapter?
So I have a suggestion to chapters to consider if you're going to be back in person on campus and you're going to be looking at programming. I would reach out to both Blair Kennedy and Brendan Wall. They are from Illinois State University, and they started a women's leadership panel at their campus. And when I was an advisor at K-State, our chapter, the 6th chapter, also did that. And that was a good eye opener for a lot of our students because it was open to the campus, and they brought in women leaders from across the community and within the campus and the Manhattan community. I was at Kansas State University, and it was such a good learning experience because these women shared stories that they probably would have never shared in another forum. So something that you might want to do is when you get back on campus, and if your campus is open for doing some programming, that would be a great way to do that as well.
Kirsten, in the chat, Cassie said that she is unable to speak right now, but she highly recommends everyone to read Burnout: The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle.
Also, can we just give Cassie a shout out? Because I also see that she can't speak because she has a baby sleeping on her, and like way to multitask. So I think I am just gonna call that out because that should also be celebrated. I saw Dr. Krabacher's comment earlier as well about how even in the Olympics, kind of that motherhood piece where that tends to get in the way often of promotion. And, you know, I would like to think that as much as caretakers over COVID, it has been harder to set us back. I would also hope that this is where workplace policies can continue to evolve to be more flexible, and there can be more opportunities to work from home. You know, I think there's just a lot we can learn. So kudos to you for having the baby and being here.
I was going to make one more comment about Alice and Felix, and I think it's something that we can all take away. If you followed her story 3 years ago, she's an incredibly decorated athlete. She's won 11 Olympic gold medals now. As of this morning, she surpassed Carl Lewis in the number of track and field Olympic medals. But 3 years ago, she's 35 currently. 3 years ago, when she became pregnant, she wanted to start a family, and she was renegotiating her contract with Nike. And she had really loved representing Nike. She had been really proud of the way that they had commercials, you know, focused on girls and women's empowerment. And she, you know, I think the negotiations ended up being painful because she had really believed in their cause, and they were going to cut her pay by 70% because she was pregnant, and they were insisting that she perform at a certain level after she gave birth. And so, I mean, it's a very blatant example of the motherhood penalty on the, you know, on the world stage. And so she ended up leaving Nike, and she signed with another company, Athleta, another apparel company, and she started designing her own shoes. And then she came back to this Olympics, and now she's the most decorated track and field star ever. And so I just, you know, I think that one of the things that's so impressive is not just how she handled the negotiation, but she has been a major advocate for women and has really used her voice on the world stage. And there are a lot of athletic companies that have changed their guidelines and rules and what they have offered to women to have more maternity protections. And so I think all of us have the ability to shine a spotlight on these injustices. And so I feel like we can take, you know, we can use her as our guide in doing that. And so that's one of the reasons I really, really admire her. Oops. Sorry. Thanks.
I have a question. So I think for a lot of us as young leaders, on college campuses. At least personally, I feel like, I don't want to speak for everyone, but I feel like I've had a lot of leadership opportunities to pursue and haven't really faced a lot of challenges or roadblocks as a female. But obviously I'm aware of, all the challenges that women face. What would maybe someone's advice be for kind of that transition period as we leave the university and move into our first time job? What are some things to expect, to be prepared for, to kind of think about in that transition, other than maybe just negotiating a salary?
Yeah, that's great. And that's a great question. And I'd love for others to chime in as well that have been in the workforce for a while. Also, I have hope in the next generation that a lot of the gender inequities will continue to become more equitable. But I also want to be realistic that the progress has been slow to change. And so I think we see this often on campus because, again, the numbers, right? I also like data. I'm somebody that I like data. And we know that we have more women on college campuses than men. And so as a result, that often means that opportunities on college campuses can present themselves. And so then there is this change all of a sudden when we go into the workplace. And right, I see Cassie referencing again kind of the children and the discrimination based on pregnancy. I don't want to, I've unfortunately seen a lot of my peers and colleagues, especially at that point where they chose motherhood, the difference between if their partner was a male and the differences in how they both parented and were potentially treated at work. There is data out there that talks about how fatherhood is celebrated in the work, and they get pat on the back, and they may even get a little bit of a promotion, and they're taken out for celebrations, and it makes them be more esteemed and seem more responsible, where they then move up the ladder, where the opposite happens to women, right? And so I think it's being aware. I think, again, it's a lot of the bias that happens in the hiring. And so, and I think, not to bring the Olympics back in, but since Anne mentioned this, and I don't want to, right, this isn't the venue to get into the mental health conversation, though that's a really important conversation. But if you even look at pre-Olympics, when Simone Biles was being referred to as the GOAT, and some people were really offended by that. And they're like, well, how dare she be so brazen and call herself the GOAT? Yet we have conversations about LeBron James or Michael Jordan or every other male athlete all the time being the GOAT. And nobody tells them that that's not appropriate because they're a man, right? But she is the GOAT, but it's because she was a female that all of a sudden now she's bragging, or it's right. And so there's, again, that there's some probably it's into some of the pressure that then, but again, that's another conversation. So I think there's this piece that in the workplace, right, the same thing, you hear it where if women speak up, they're thought of as being too assertive and too aggressive, or when men speak up, they're really strong leaders. And so I think there's a piece where being aware of it to go in is really important. And then I think it's helping to just change those practices, right, and break down those barriers. But again, I think that's where apply for jobs, right? So even if it's not the negotiation, just getting yourself out there and applying, but also promote other really excellent women, and so how do you continue to advocate for them? Because maybe you're also in your role in mortar board and on campus because you have some leadership just competences that maybe some of your peers don't have. And it doesn't mean that they also wouldn't be strong, particularly in the workforce. And so how do we help each other grow as well? I think oftentimes women can be competitive in different ways. And so how do, but I think, all people are. Okay, I'm going to stop there and let other people answer.
Can I add in on that, Kirsten?
Please.
So I think it also comes down to really acknowledging and being aware of the culture of the company as well in the organization that you're involved in. So I was actually disheartened earlier this week because, I work for Deere, as Anna, but we had an intern on our team this summer, and my team, I did not go on this trip, but my team went out with her to a field trial that we had with another company that was there. And while they were at supper that evening, a representative from that other company asked her what she was interested in doing, and she really wants to go to law school. And his response was that that's a good way to go because a lot of law firms need good secretaries. And her boss, so the person who works for Deere, literally looked at her and said, go to the bathroom, and confronted the guy at the table and was like, that is not appropriate, like completely stood up for her, which was very respectful. But unfortunately, I actually interned at that same company and could tell you how big of a difference culture means and how big of an emphasis I put in that when it comes to making my job decision. So I would just say that's something to be aware of too, because I would say companies, yeah, like culture just really shapes the way that that can be seen.
Kayla, I'm so glad you brought up that example. I'm really sorry to hear that example happen, but I think it happens more often than we want it to happen in 2021. And it's sometimes even not that blatant. But, you know, even in the workplace, I've been in HR for 15 years, and when there's an inter-office relationship, the women often get slut shamed, the men not so much. And I hate like just being that blunt, but we need to be that blunt in this conversation, and it's totally unfair. I do completely agree with you though. If the environment at the top doesn't support and put their money where their mouth is around equity, and when you even ask questions about, well, how are you promoting women at your organization or women in leadership? If it's just perfunctory, you can tell like from what's on the website or how people respond in interviews, and that stuff really matters. Like check out the website, and if there's pictures of people and it's only white men, it says something about the culture, because if they're more than 10 years old, that was a 10-year-old problem that was perpetuated. And then the other thing I just say is if your organization has like an employee resource group or affinity group or whatever they might call it for women, I'd say join it and become active, because a lot of times those are safe spaces to bring up issues and say, this is how I've been treated, or a client said this to me, or a colleague said this to me, and that can really actually improve change and can advocate for things like better maternity pay and leave and those kinds of things. So if there's a resource group for women in your organization, I think it's a good sign, and I definitely encourage anyone to join it.
Thank you. Yeah, I see Crystal's comment. Sure, I want to take more leadership roles on campus, but afraid that being a mother of 2 active boys will be looked at as a negative aspect. But I cannot commit to their program, right? And so not all women enter parenthood, but there's definitely kind of that parenthood difference often that can happen. But again, even just familial caretakers in general often falls to females. So I think it's keeping that in mind. Again, it's the policies that are in place, and unfortunately, again, with some of the statistics that we see around even sexual harassment, and I think somebody had put it in there, right? If you see something, say something, but that's also really easier for us to say in a space like this than when you're on the job and then you're like, yeah, but if I say something, then am I going to risk my own career trajectory, or what does that look like? But I think that's why, Katie's conversation about joining those affinity groups, finding those places to be able to go and have those conversations are really important. And this is where I would say continue to use your mortarboard network as well, through not only your chapter, but through other alumni events and other aspects, and know that you continue to have a network of people, whether it's not only for making the connection, but just a space to ask questions and ask for advice. And I want to be cognizant of time. And so maybe with that, we'll wrap it up, because it is 5 p.m. Eastern. And I know we still have another chapter operation session. I want you to have a time to stretch your legs and do some self-care in the next 15 minutes. But I'm really appreciative for those of you that continue to ask questions and contribute to the conversations and were engaged. So thank you. And I only wish I could have have this conversation and continue to talk with everyone. So hopefully we will have those chances, and enjoy the rest of your conference.